Shadow Minister.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Twigg, and I want to thank members for their contributions and actually thank the more than 700,000 people who signed this petition, including more than 1,000 in my own constituency of Bexley and Battle. And this is a very real issue in my part of East Sussex. The government forced on us the Crowborough asylum camp just over the border in the Madam Deputy Speaker's constituency, but very close to my own. We met with the Minister just last week alongside local residents and councillors and heard firsthand about the groups of young men gathering in this small rural town to drink on the street, smuggling alcohol back into the detention centre, working illegally, and all the distress that's causing them. I'm not surprised the government targeted Wealdon for a camp, considering it's run by the Lib Dems and Greens and their kind of refugee asylum safe haven policy. Because at the heart of this debate is a question of control, whether the state and the people on whose behalf it operates have control of our borders or not. For the nation state to have meaning, whether it's because we want to send people to offshore processing or detention or deport them entirely, a country must be able to remove people from within its borders that have no right to be there and at scale. So I welcome the opportunity to set out the overwhelming rational and moral argument for ending small boat crossings and illegal trade in people smuggling that's at the forefront of this petition. Because whatever opponents of strong border control say, however much they attempt to demonise and caricature those of us that want to see control returned, I know that not only is it what the vast majority of the British public want, it's the right thing to do. Because you have to be clear-eyed about the status quo. Right now, not only is our asylum policy effectively determined by the ability of people to pay to get here, the trade in itself is putting money directly into the pockets of criminal gangs that are also involved in other crime like drug dealing and violence. Whether or not you make the crossing is not a measure of your need, your comparative level of desperation or fear or your vulnerability. It's in fact quite the opposite. Small boat crossings favour the able-bodied, those with sufficient money to pay for the journey, those closest to Europe. It's not based on anything Parliament or government has decided or a reflection of humanitarian crises. We know for a fact that every single person making the crossing from France, because they're coming from France, is not fleeing directly from a war-torn country where they're at risk of persecution. Decent, caring, compassionate constituents of mine say to me all the time, they are safe, they're in France. Now, people may have a preference, a desire to be here instead of in France, but that is not what the asylum system was set up for. That's not what the laws and protections were intended to enshrine and make sacrosanct. However much defenders of those laws and regulations choose to ignore that, the British public can see through it. The first retort to these criticisms of the status quo is to say, well, that's our fault. That's our responsibility for forcing them to cross the channel, as the spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats said. But proponents of that argument entirely fail to play through the consequences of the safe and legal routes that they advocate for. So I'll do so now in the hope that people might actually consider it. If we set up places whereby people can apply in third countries easily, what would happen? First of all, those places would then themselves become a focal point of potentially large numbers of people seeking asylum, as there are quite literally millions of people living under conditions that would qualify them to seek asylum here in the UK. And however much people pretend otherwise, we clearly would have to refuse some of those applications. Though, of course, the Green Party advocate open borders and no restrictions, so maybe they wouldn't, but let's assume we wouldn't take everybody that applied by a safe and legal route. Then what would happen? Would those people simply turn around and say, oh, well, I tried to get in, I tried to use the safe and legal route, I'll leave it there? Of course they wouldn't. Those people would then turn to exactly the same people smuggling gangs and illegal crossings and would be right back to square one, only they would be coming on top of the ones granted asylum as part of safe and legal routes. Even the most humanitarian-minded person would have to accept there would be limits, and if there are limits, you have to say no, and for no to mean anything, it has to be enforceable or the whole thing collapses. And those opposed to deportation, for those coming here illegally, have no answer to that moral and logical question. So what must we do? We must make it absolutely clear that if you come here illegally, you do not get to stay. No ifs, ands or buts. Everything else in terms of control and having a system that works is underpinned by that. If you don't have control and a meaningful control, because taking years to deport people will achieve nothing, then all the rest of the policies collapse. And to stand any chance of actually delivering that, we have to come out of the European Court on Human Rights. Anyone who studied the expansion of the powers of that court cannot reasonably argue that it is fulfilling the same function intended for it. Some may argue they're happy with that they welcome that, but it's impossible to say it's operating as envisioned by its creators. Let's take one example, Article 3, the right to be protected from torture or inhumane and degrading treatment. This right was constructed in the wake of World War II, where alongside being murdered, Jews, political prisoners, homosexuals, other minorities were subject to the most horrendous treatment imaginable: medical experimentation, starvation, death-inducing slave labour. How now is that right, that Article 3 right, interpreted? It's now used by potential deportees to successfully oppose their deportation if the standard of healthcare in the country they would be returned to is not sufficient to meet their medical needs. The same standard of healthcare that's available to millions of their fellow citizens in the countries that we would seek to deport them to. When did a right to be protected from torture or inhumane or degrading treatment become a right to access a particular standard of healthcare? And we know the Convention has now even gone as far as to be applied to questions of whether a particular government is doing enough to tackle climate change. That's why even some of our most senior and respected jurists, like former UK Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption, are clear about the need to leave. I would recommend to anyone sincerely interested in this topic listening to his 2019 BBC Reith Lecture series on it. He explains clearly how human rights laws are increasingly used in the place of the practice of politics, democracy and elections, because they have increasingly become questions of balancing. They always were, of course, but the balancing has become finer and finer, more and more nuanced, and at their heart, those questions are societal and political ones, not legal ones. Yeah. And we should ask how it's possibly come to this situation. It's come about because at its core, in the context of its willingness to expand its remit to take expansionist interpretations to the law, the European Court of Human Rights is at its heart fundamentally misconceived. The law does not exist in isolation. In the nation state, there is an interplay between the courts and judges, parliaments and the executives and the people, and they balance each other out. Courts are, of course, operationally independent, but if they act intolerably, if they consistently and gravely make rulings out of keeping with the views of the public they serve, Parliament can step in, the body accountable to the public. However much, in very many ways, we want our courts to be independent, it is vital that in the end, ultimately, they are not independent of the people. This delicate interplay secures legitimacy for each actor in the system, and there is no such interplay in the European Court. And that's how it's found itself so clearly removed from the expectations and views of the millions of people of the member states it seeks to advocate for. And you can see across the rulings over many years, member states seeking to oppose the expansionist rulings it's taking, and it has ignored them to its own detriment. And we see other countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, able to manage fair and balanced rules of law with rights for individuals without the need to be part of any supranational body. And so I'd say to anyone who argues against these ideas that you must be careful what one wishes for, because the patience and generosity of the majority of the public are at its utmost thinnest, if not exhausted entirely. And if we don't respond to that, there are others with views we are more widely unhappy with that will take back control, and that this government has failed to secure it will be as much to blame as anybody else. As we complete 2 years of this premiership of our current Prime Minister, I hope many members can reflect honestly. The promise of the government to take control of our border and smash the gangs have undoubtedly been a failure. It gave the impression that tweaks could be made that could significantly alter the number of crossings, but that has simply proven not to be the case, and it now has very little time left. The only country with a proven track record is Australia, and they implemented a policy of not allowing people to stay. Tweaking won't help. One in, one out with France won't help, and the sooner they realise that, the better. The better for the taxpayer, the better for those who want to be compassionate but don't want to be exploited, the better for the crime agencies fighting the gangs that the people smugglers are part of. Virtue signalling won't achieve anything. Doing whatever it takes to actually regain control of our borders is the only thing that will, and the government must get on and deliver it.